Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Today, friends, we have another exciting guest on this podcast. His name is Jay Delancy from the Transparency in Elections Party. He's going to talk to us about his ideas for election reform and his ideas for making alternative parties better. So welcome to the podcast, Jay.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you for having me. How are you today?
I am decent. And I trust
Good.
you are too.
Yes, indeed. I thank you.
We're not going to let this polar vortex stop us, right?
I refuse. No, it's just weather. Come on, we can do it.
Yep. So if we could start
where do we
by,
begin?
please give us an introduction to yourself, a brief biographical sketch.
Okay. I'm retired from the Air Force in 2011, but I had been wanting to do some sort of election watchdog group since the Bush-Gore election.
Okay.
When I realized that nobody was watching the watchdogs or the people that were actually, counting the votes. I wondered who's watching them. So I wanted to do that, and there was so much we didn't know about it. But I was still in the military, so there wasn't a lot I could do. But as soon as I retired, we had been planning for a while to work in North Carolina because that's my home I was going to go back to. So we made a state-based group called Voter Integrity Project of NC. And the first thing we did was held a press conference and a rally at the same time in front of the legislature advocating for voter ID. They had a bill on the books, or not on the books, but a bill that had been proposed, but the Republican legislature, it had broken down into a partisan game. So all Democrats were against it, all Republicans were for it. And at the time, the Republicans did not have a veto-proof majority. So they passed it, and the governor vetoed it. And the same day the governor vetoed it, she issued an invitation to all the legislators to come to a party over at the governor's mansion. They were having a formal dinner or something. And one of the people on the house, in the house, read the invitation out loud on the floor because it said 2 forms of ID were required in order to enter the festive occasion at the governor's mansion.
Wow.
And they all had a laugh, and that was kind of the end of it, and voter ID died again. So we started working it in 2012. We started in 2011, and we continued to work, started looking for patterns of fraud because I realized the biggest complaint that the anti-voter ID people had was that it wasn't needed because there is no vote fraud. And I view that as gaslighting, that there is vote fraud. But we've developed the argument, developed the case, and I could go through the whole history of the case and how it worked and how we know this. But the bottom line is the solution to all of it is transparency. And the way to get there is for people to volunteer as poll workers and to get in there and start seeing the system and take it over with people who care more about the process than they do about either side winning. They just want to make sure it's a fair fight. And so we get those people running elections that are less political and more just, wonkish people that want to follow the processes. Those are my people. Those are who we, if you will. I never thought of it as a party until I saw your podcast channel. But those are our party, the people who – I met a lady the other day who hates politics. She said, I hate politics. I don't even vote. I hate it. I said, you're perfect. You're exactly who we need. Because that's who I want, is people who really – they don't really care for the politicians, but they want to make sure the process is as fair and accurate as can be.
Okay, so when you're looking at the process, how do you make it fair? What are you observing exactly, specifically?
Well, there's four aspects to transparency of elections, and when you have transparency in these 4 areas, you have free and open and honest elections. I like open and honest, or free and fair, and they are who can vote, who did vote, how the votes are counted, and the chain of custody of the ballots.
Okay.
Actually, I got that out of order. Chain is the third one. So it's who can, who did, the chain, and the counting, how they're counted. You want to make sure that the public can see it. They can see everyone who's registered to vote, that is public information. And then you need to know who did vote in a timely manner, because they have all these laws, like we heard in 2020, how people were contesting the Georgia election or the Pennsylvania election, Arizona election, and some dark judicial forces came after them and said, "How dare you? You can't do that." But you can. You can. Every state has a provision where if you have illegal votes being counted and someone knows that they're being counted and can prove it, then you can. And if the gap of the illegal votes will impact the election, per that state's law, there's a way to undo the election. It's part of British common law. It's just the way it is. And we have that in North Carolina, and that's something we have learned to use. In 2020, we found dead voters and were able to protest the election, and it worked out well. It had a great effect, and because it was a very narrow election, and the other side was trying to change. They were protesting by saying felons were illegally disenfranchised, which wasn't true, but they were saying it anyway. And we came in with dead voters and said, well, you're trying to defend the voting rights of dead voters. And so when we did that, they threw their hands up and said, all right, we'll drop ours if you'll drop yours, because it was creating legal expense problems. So you can't do that unless you know who did vote.
Okay.
So the can vote, I got out of order here. Can vote is, do the people live at the address they say they live at? This is a real problem when in this last election in North Carolina, we had thousands and thousands of people from overseas who claimed to have some tie to North Carolina, and it's a loophole in our state law that allows them to be counted even if they've never been here, and even if their parents were not from here. It's really bad, and I think our legislature is going to fix it because they now see the problem. And the way the problem manifested itself was that a Republican for a statewide judicial race had won by 10,000 votes, and they started counting those overseas ballots, and the guy wound up losing by 700. So it was just, are these people even from here? And we know for a fact that some of them are not. We're getting prosecutions on a couple of them, but it's very difficult to collect that evidence. And it's a case that we've been working on for several years regarding a known fictional mailbox. Well, it's called a traveling mailbox store, and these people were getting their mail at that address, and they voted from that address, even though they were warned that they have to vote from their residency, and they told election officials, this is my residency, and then they voted, and the district attorney in that county is planning to prosecute those 3 voters because they were never here, they never lived here, they had no ties to here, yet their votes counted. So you can't even know. You have to see the voter roll and have public, open, transparent access to that voter roll in order to know who can vote. So we like that kind of transparency. Who did vote, we want to know as soon as possible after the election who these people are who voted. And it's tough because a lot of states sit on that information until after they certify the election. So there's no way you can protest the election even if you know there was illegal voting going on, because you can't collect the evidence until after the election, until it's too late, basically. So that's who can vote, who did vote, and then the chain of custody. This is where none of the ballot handling should be done under the cloak of darkness. It should be done with complete public transparency.
Yeah.
And we saw that in cases in 2020 where election officials, I think it was in Michigan, they were, because of COVID, they were putting up glass barriers, keeping people out from watching the process very closely. And even then, in one jurisdiction, they stuck cardboard over the windows so people couldn't see what was going on. And that just, all these things. Oh, and the last one is just chain of custody. Wait a minute. Can, did, chain, and count, and how the votes are counted. Actually, I got out of order there. I did that a lot on this broadcast. Okay, the chain of custody involves what happens when the ballots leave the polls. Do they take a lengthy delay somewhere while the person carrying them is manipulating them? And there's a famous story involving a South Dakota politician where the voting was on a tribe on an Indian reservation, and the ballots were put in the back of a van with one Democrat and one Republican. And then when they got in the van, they locked it. It was a closed back end, and they're supposed to keep an eye on each other. And then the Republican allegedly said, okay, where do we go from here? Let's get to work. And the Democrat was gobsmacked to realize the Republican was going to help the Democrat change the election. And this goes back a while. It was when Tom Daschle was head of the Senate, and that guy doing that enabled Daschle to win. It was a very close election. And 6 years later, there were safeguards taken where that wouldn't happen again, and Daschle lost. So who's to say if just those ballots from a reservation was enough? That's a famous story that's documented in a book that I did not write, but it's a book by John Fund, who's written written 2 books on election fraud.
Okay.
And it's just one of those stories that. Go ahead.
Do you think Daschle himself approved that, or was that somebody thinking they were doing it in his best interest?
Well, I would think that his campaign would probably, part of it affects policy, where, for example, voter ID, if I'm the guy who's responsible for getting Daschle elected, I'm going to go to him when a voter ID law comes up and says, now you need to know that we're against that. And Daschle's like, okay. Because if the guy who makes me get elected needs a certain policy not to be on the books, in other words, whether he directly knew, he had someone on his payroll who did know, and there's money involved in this, and it's
okay.
It is so. Can you ever implicate a politician? The longer they're there, I suspect they know, because what we find in North Carolina, that politicians, I'm sure it's true in Texas too, that they're like bananas. When they show up at your state house, they're green, and then after a while they get yellow, and then they're there too long and they turn rotten. And this is so when they're in that yellow to rotting phase, they can't win an election, yet somehow they keep getting reelected.
Oh.
And it's been a rude awakening for me in working with Democrats and Republicans. Well, let me try that again. Working with Republicans. I have not worked with any Democrats, but in working with some Republicans, I concluded that the reason they wanted to work with me was because they were spying on me. And then they fired us once they understood what we wanted to do and how we were going to undo his defeat. Because it involved non-citizen voting, and that's the source of a book I've written. But it is the way to undo a lot of close elections. If the burden of proof is just to show that illegal votes were cast, that is a way to undo the election. But it's very difficult to do it when the government studiously hides the public information that would indicate somebody is not a citizen. Which, if someone's not a citizen, okay, that's fine. But if they're not a citizen and they're voting, that's a problem. It's a felony. And it's sad because a lot of them, what we've seen in the prosecutions, now I think there's a much larger number of people who do know what they're doing, but I think there's a small number of them who honestly got a driver's license and somehow were tricked into believing that they were legal voters, because these
Oh,
are
like they
people
thought they
who,
had motor voter in their state and they didn't.
right, yes,
Okay.
where I blame the DMV officials, but then there's activists who convince the non-citizen that, oh, you can vote, and that's a felony in North Carolina to entice someone who is illegally registered, or to entice, the exact wording of it, I think it's to entice a non-citizen. I should be ready for you, but I can look it up if you want the
It's
exact
okay.
statute. But if you are trying to entice somebody to vote when they're not allowed to, when the law doesn't allow it, that's a felony on you also for trying to entice them. It's kind of like conspiracy to commit a crime or soliciting a crime, only
Okay.
usually soliciting a crime is lower than committing the crime, but for vote fraud, it's the same level of
Oh,
penalty.
okay. I get you. So it's like eating and abetting.
Yeah, only it's worse, because usually even aiding and abetting is usually like if someone commits murder and it's a class 1 felony or whatever y'all call it, class A felony in North Carolina, then soliciting or aiding and abetting or conspiring is a class B felony. It's a funny thing about criminal statute in North Carolina that soliciting or aiding and abetting, just certain things you do, it's almost the same, but it's not as bad as it is on the guy who pulled the trigger, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So, but with vote fraud, it's different. They actually say, no, it's the same level of crime. It's a very low felony, but it's the same level of crime. So we
Oh,
win.
yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah, sounds like a white collar felony. So both parties are doing this stuff, right? It's not one party or the other, right?
Well, our evidence on what the Democrats are doing is is where I can't pin it on Democrats. It's all hearsay from what I've
Okay.
just heard from various people involved and what they've told me. I mean, some of it very credible, like a known Democrat ballot harvester who was paid, who paid someone who paid $10 and bought a ballot from somebody, and there was a good reason it was not prosecuted, but it's a fact. I mean, what they wanted was the Democrat ballot harvester, but the guy who admitted it didn't want to go public with the information, but he told two people that were running for county commission. One was black and one was white, and the white guy was the guy I happen to know is a Republican, and he said the person they knocked on the door to talk to was black also, was black. And because these two guys are standing there, he said, oh, Fisher McMillan already bought my vote. And my friend who was running for commissioner was like, do what? Who? And he looked him up, and this guy had gotten thousands of dollars from the Democrat candidate, and as some sort of services, that were publicly reported on his campaign finance for consulting. And what my friend was able to conclude was that part of that consulting fee, this dude was walking around buying ballots from people, and knocking on their door and buying them. And
Oh,
that was a Democrat. That was a Democrat, and
okay.
it benefited the Democrat. Now my guy in a Republican who was a state senator with a lot of big government contracts locally. He was working with groups that were in on a lot of the bad policies and bad activism. That's a whole nother story, but it was he wanted me to he had lost by a little under 400 votes, and I told him I could help him, but in order to do that, I would need for him to go to his clerk of courts and get a listing, get the name and address of everybody who got out of jury duty by proving to the courts that they were not U.S. citizens. And he hemmed and hawed, and he wouldn't do it. And I found that is an issue that Republicans, there's a lot of Republicans who are very happy with non-citizens basically doing like they did in England, just taking over the country. They're happy with that even here. And this guy, I figured he wouldn't do it for me because he was part of the big, I should call them rhinos or whatever, but he had rhino leanings. And
Okay.
by rhino, I mean Republican in name only.
Yep.
And he had, in a word, he was a globalist. And like a Tom Tillis Republican who thinks the most important priority is cheap labor for the big businesses so they can keep the wage base good and low and keep the stock dividends good and high. And the stockholders are the people who fund his campaign instead of the workers. So,
Sure.
That's kind of a nutshell of what it was. But so that was a Republican who was doing that. And then there was the infamous 2018. There was something in the news in North Carolina about a congressman who had a Republican helping him. It's widely reported. The congressman was Mark Harris, and the consultant was named McCrae Dallas, Dowless, and McCrae never got his day in court, but after the evidentiary hearing and after he was charged, he started talking to me, and we talked a lot. I became friends with him, and I've yet to write a book about it, but I'm convinced that he technically had not broken the law because I think he knew the law better than anybody. But the reason he was targeted was way beyond election fraud. It had more to do with getting rid of Mark Harris out of that congressional seat. And that's but he was a Republican, and if you look in the media, if you even Google the term Republican vote fraud North Carolina, that story comes up because it was greatly and widely misreported in the media to where when I write it's going to be considered revisionist history just because I took my time and didn't rush out with a book and wanted to get some of these cases through the trial. But oddly, all the people, everybody except for one has either died or pled out just to avoid prosecution because the person they wanted was Dallas, and they never got him because he passed away, but they delayed the trial for 3 years. And I think they didn't want to go to court because he could cross-examine witnesses and he could get discovery, and he knew who the bad guys were in his county. So that's a long way of saying, yes, both parties are doing it, but it's just different burden, just different levels of proof to all of that. Some of it is inferential and some of it is hard evidence.
Okay, gotcha. So you're mentioning that you were writing a book about a related topic in this. Please tell our audience what that book is about.
Okay, I wrote a book with a triggering title called Aliens Among Us. And the subtitle is How Non-U.S. Citizens Have Infiltrated America's Electoral Process and What You Can Do About it. Now, what happened, we discovered this. It's all about illegal aliens or illegal immigrants or whatever you want to call them, who are voting. And we caught them. We found the way through this jury disqualification process, which in Florida, I discovered that it was legal in Florida for a journalist to go get the jury list and to look at them and match them against the voter rolls, and then confront people who had voted who were listed as non-citizens. It's a dangerous job. I wouldn't do that. But what I did do was turn the names in. We did this in North Carolina, and I turned the names in to the county election officials in the form of a voter challenge. And that is a quasi-judicial legal proceeding where they have to have an open public hearing on it and all that stuff. And they did, but it surprised me because instead of thanking us, they found ways to discredit us and to deny everything that we had done and dismiss it all. But then a week later, they went ahead and, at the end of it, we had 18 people that were charged that were sustained through the evidentiary hearing.
Oh.
And then of the 18, we had over 500 of them that we originally brought to the election officials, and they dismissed all but 18 of them. And we were furious because the 18 were the ones who had legally gotten a driver's license and had told the state they were not U.S. citizens. And so we were wondering, why are there 500 of them who got a driver's license, but the state, the DMV, did not know these people are not citizens, yet the person walked into court and proved they were not citizens. So our election officials dismissed all of them that the DMV did not confirm, which made me very angry because those were the people who were subverting the law, and they only went after the 18 who were more or less, to one degree or another, following the law. But what turned out was, of the 18, we had 3 that requested removal from the list. Let me think. We had 11. Oh, I know what it was. It was 11 that were they never responded, and it resulted in a criminal referral to federal election officials. And then there were 3 who they admitted they were not citizens and said they didn't know how I got on the list. Please take me off the list. And then there were 4 who had become naturalized citizens, and the state did not prosecute any of them that voted prior to their naturalization. So of 18, we had 14 that confirmed what we were doing. So the process worked, and we knew we'd gotten cheated on the 500. And the reason we got cheated was because we didn't have a lawyer, and they brought everything. There was a big left-wing activist group, a Soros-backed group that was working the referees, working the election officials, and 2 of the 3 were Democrats, and they denied everything we did. And the one Republican on the board was the one who got the criminal referrals later. But they'd worked to discredit us and deny what we're doing. And then the activists from that group lied publicly, saying that we had mistakenly gone after people who just said they were not citizens of this county or of the state instead of U.S. citizens. And that turned out not to be true because these people were criminally referred, and there's no law against voting from being from another state and voting, but there are laws against being from another country and voting. So the criminal referrals proved that we were right. But then a funny thing happened, because between the election officials and the court officials and the legislature, they blocked our access to that information again. So we wanted to get more of it, and other activists and others. This was 2012 when this happened. And so there were a lot of, we were not in this about citizens. It wasn't a question. What I'm trying to say is we're not an immigration activist group. This was an election integrity question for me. But there were some immigration activist groups that were very interested in what we were doing, and they started contacting me wanting to know how we did it. And just a few weeks after we did what we did, they changed all the rules, and they refused to give that information out anymore. So we found that the courts had blocked us. So we went to the legislature to try and get them to fix it, and they wouldn't do it. And part of my book documents what happened then and how it worked, but it took us 10 years, and we finally were able to get the law passed that would make that information at least make the court officials share the information with election officials. But the problem was the way they got it passed was by putting a secrecy provision in it to where the public could not look over the shoulder of anybody in that process just to make sure they were doing it. So we don't have transparency, and that's a problem.
Yeah.
So we'd recommend pushing for transparency wherever you are. this book, my first book published, Aliens Among Us, talks about the one area of non-citizen voting, and there's many, many aspects to it. But there are others that we worked on. For example, interstate double voting, where people would be registered and vote in two states for the same election. We've caught numerous people doing that and even gotten some of them prosecuted. But it's difficult travels in that lane because the DAs don't want to prosecute them. And that was a Republican DA we found in one case who would not prosecute two cases that we had of, actually it was two perps, one Republican, but he didn't like the optics. He wouldn't admit that to us, but he just argued with us till the cows came home, arguing how it just wasn't worth his time to do it and he wasn't going to do it. And he made all kinds of excuses. And the bottom line was he didn't care if non-citizens were or if people were committing election fraud, rather, by voting in two states for the same election. He didn't care, and he didn't want to fight it, and he might lose. So he wouldn't do it.
So what's in the mind of the people that are doing this? The people who are doing those people who are registering in two states, what are they thinking? What are in their minds?
Well, when caught, most of them will say they didn't know it was against the law, or someone told them they could do it. That's the only way out in North Carolina. Now, under federal law, ignorance of the law is no excuse, but in North Carolina, the DA has to prove the person intended to do it, intended to commit fraud when they did it. And so that's the excuse they use. But what I wanted to see was to get them, to prosecute them and maybe get a guilty plea to a lesser charge, which I think they could have done, because a jury would realize that if you voted in two states that you had to know what you were doing. That everyone knows. It's just common sense. And that was my argument with the DA, but he wouldn't go there because he's a political animal and he was afraid he'd lose. So we embarrassed him later. We did get to embarrass him because in North Carolina there's a law that if you're a DA and you have either an election fraud or campaign finance fraud, criminal referral that you've sat on for more than 45 days, a private citizen of that county can walk into the court and petition the court to appoint a special prosecutor.
Wow.
And that's a public proceeding. And so I did that to that DA. And it embarrassed him, but it didn't hurt his career, because we found out he was being nominated for U.S. attorney under Trump in 2017, and we didn't like it, and we wanted the public. We were hoping that Trump would see the guy was weak on voter fraud and get rid of him, but he didn't. We were idealistic and thinking that if we could get this into the Charlotte newspaper or on TV, then Trump will hear about it and he'll withdraw the nomination. What we didn't know was it was too late. Once that nomination goes forward, the fix is already in, and it involves your U.S. senators nominating the guy and all that stuff. So we got in way too late. We should have done that. If we played that card earlier, we might have been able to dirty him up. But he was appointed U.S. attorney, and that was just the nature. Learning as you get into this, the more you get into it, the more you start seeing what politicians are made of, and that can be discouraging. But I love transparency. Transparency is the answer.
So what happened when you brought it to the court? Did the special prosecutor, what did they say about it?
Well, it was to the Superior Court. Okay. And the judge just refused to take it up.
Oh, okay.
And that was that. But we got our press release out of it, and that the candidate accused me of just trying to get publicity. He was actually right. I wanted to dirty up his name, but it wasn't publicity for me. It wasn't for fundraising. It was for the public to see who he was. But with a Superior Court judge, the chief judge of Superior Court, the highest ranking under North Carolina law, that's the highest ranking judge at the local court. So in that district, and the district attorney, the judge and the DA evidently they have a relationship to some degree that's not completely adversarial. And the judge, he refused to take it up. We filed our special proceeding. We had paid our $250 and filed the proceeding, and then called the media and said, "Hey, we just did this," and that was news. So at least we got the news out on it, but that was all we got because the judge wouldn't do it, and we didn't push it. It was enough when I realized that we weren't going to derail his nomination. We didn't have the money to harass him just for the sake of harassing him. Plus, he became U.S. attorney, and if I'd gone into Western North Carolina, he could have had me locked up for something.
Oh no! Oh no!
Yeah. So we didn't push it too hard, but we wanted to get the word out on him.
Yeah, you didn't want to make him feel like he was crossed, huh?
Well, I wanted him to. I was hoping the public would understand what a bad guy he was, and that the president would not let him be nominated. But after we realized that wasn't going to work, I didn't have the money to, I'm not independently wealthy, and we didn't have the donor base to file an appeal and, to really file the motions it would take to force that judge to take the matter up. We could have done it. There are things we could have done differently in terms of maybe a writ of mandamus or something like that we could have forced the judge to take up the case, because it's right there in the law that not only can he do it, but the funding for the special prosecutor would come out of the district attorney's office. It's really a pretty good way. It's not a bad way to deal with a corrupt DA.
Oh yeah, it's a good check on their power, huh?
Somewhat, yeah. The only question is, what happens if the local judge is in on it too? That might be the case, So you need. I know in some states they allow the attorney general to take up those cases when the DA won't do it.
Okay.
But to my knowledge, we don't have that capability here. Although I've seen attorney general step in on the famous Duke lacrosse case. The attorney general stepped in when he felt like the local DA was corrupt, but that was a different. That was a whole different case. It had nothing to do with voter fraud.
Yeah. Okay. So you say that your first book was Aliens Among Us. You've written other books as well?
I've got another book in progress now. It's on voter fraud in general. This is my first book, though. I just published it last year, and I'm working on I'm finishing up the outline for the one on voter fraud, because we've been collecting through my years of speaking and sharing the challenges that we've had. I've run into people who witnessed voter fraud and were very credible witnesses, and I interviewed them. First-person account of voter fraud, and we're compiling that into a book, and then letting the reader draw some conclusions about it, because this is the kind of fraud that's the most difficult to prove, which is voter impersonation fraud.
Oh wow!
And to have eyewitnesses, when you have eyewitnesses to that, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
So part of the story was what election officials did when the evidence was brought forward, and that became part of the story, because the way they actively worked to downplay it and basically do nothing or worse. You do nothing, or you fire the poll observer, or in one case the employee who highlighted the problem. They fired that employee and blackballed her from working in that county anymore on elections.
Oh no!
So this is why our big takeaway is for everybody. Maybe it's not realistic to start another independent party called the Election Transparency Party, but it is within your sovereignty as an adult, as a human being with a brain in America, to go avail yourself to the process. Contact your local election office and say, I would like to work as a poll worker in the next election. What do I need to do it? And in most states, there is a local governmental jurisdiction office that supervises elections, if not all. I mean, I'm thinking about all of them to one degree or another. They do that. They take people, they bring them in, they train them. I think they pay them in most states, if not all. There's some exceptions, like in Mississippi for the primaries, there's one state employee and everybody actually working the election at the polling location are party members of the party holding their primary. So you'll have Republicans doing their primary on one day and Democrats doing theirs on another day, and only Democrats will work the polls on the Democrat primary in Mississippi. But in North Carolina, we do our primaries on the same day, and the state manages it. So there's lots of employees. You know, everyone working in the poll is a paid employee. And we need more constitutionally minded people who believe in right and wrong. We need more people like that to go get a job working at the polls, and this problem will take care of itself.
Oh, good.
A big aspect of it, you know. If you have election laws and don't follow them, then we're in trouble. But if you can get people there who care about the law and will follow them and enforce them and be cognizant of the law, we will we'll have a restored electoral process that people can believe in.
Oh, that's good. So your book, and we love to hear constitutional-minded people. That's what we're all about here. So we appreciate that. So your book, where can our audience get that?
Thanks for asking, Andrew. The easiest way to find it is go to Amazon and search my last name. That's Delancy. That's D as in dog. That's Delancy.
Okay.
C as in cat. So only one E. But if you search that, it comes right up. I used to search it by title, and this is a bad title because it's called Aliens Among Us. And so if you search that on Amazon, what you'll get is 10,000 books on UFOs.
Oh,
And
no.
somewhere in there will be my book too.
Oh,
So
no.
it's much easier. Just search my name, Delancy. Just one E, not CEY, but CY, and that'll get it. J.
Okay.
Delancy.
Okay, maybe what I can do is when I search it, I can find a link and put the link to Zach's place in the show notes, so they don't have to sort through all that.
Well, that'd be very helpful. I appreciate it, and please send me a link. I look forward to seeing what you do with this. Anyway, it's been a pleasure talking with you too.
Yeah, it was great. It's something it's another thing we haven't talked about in exactly the same way before, so we appreciate your new perspective. That's good to hear.
All right. Glad to help. Call anytime.
All right, take care and all the best.
All right. Thank you. You too.
Bye.